personal note, Jerry and I met 10 years ago. I worked as a youth director at Chapelwood. Well, I was hired as a youth director at Chapelwood United Methodist Church. And I was a whole different person 10 years ago, I could tell you that. And contemplative life was definitely not something that I even realized I had in me. Those of you that have done Enneagram work, I'm an 8. So I was the most 100 miles an hour 8 there could be. And that includes talking a lot. Very extrovert and just very social. And I think, you know, I've already found out God has a sense of humor because he gave me one daughter to raise, so I know. And then on top of it, he made me a pastor, so I know he has a sense of humor. So 10 years ago, Jerry and I happened to go to, we went to the Final Four finals here in Houston. We were hosting it, and we were invited by our senior pastor, Jim Jackson. Well, it just so happens that I sit right next to Jerry. So I'm in conversation with him, but I notice he's very quiet. And at first I'm like, well, maybe he's just, you know, he's shy or whatever. But anyways, so somehow, somewhere in the conversation, which was, I'm pretty sure it sounded more like a monologue on my side, but he was so gracious and so patient with me. We got into conversations about books. So I thought I would impress him, and I gave him a couple of titles of authors and you know, titles that I had read. And then I said, well, what about you? Well, that opened up Pandora's box, because he started telling me these names that I was like, who's Richard Rohr? And who's Saint Teresa de Avila? And all these. And so he just named all these names that I had never heard of. Well, that wasn't the bad part. The bad part, I decided to get curious, and I bought 2 books of one of the, you know, some of those authors he gave me. Well, when I started reading, I couldn't even get back past the preface, much the acknowledgments. But it was really interesting, because all along there was something luring me towards Jerry. And so he used to do our staff worship every Tuesday. So I made sure not to miss it, because I wanted to just find out, why was this calling me so much, the way that he taught? Why was it so gentle? Why was it so different than what I was used to? And I tell you what, it started making, something started happening within, that I started realizing I wanted more of it. So then I started bugging him, going to his office a lot and asking a lot of questions. Again, very gracious, very patient with me. So anyways, all that to say is that because of that patience and that graciousness, I mean, I got to tell you, he's a big part of why I am a pastor, and why God called me to also start a contemplative ministry. And he has a lot to do with that. He's mentored me. He's had plenty of lunch conversations with me. And now, recently, we've had some beautiful conversations over the phone. So it's my honor to bring him up, my friend, my teacher, my beloved brother, Jerry Weber.
Well, Victor's very gracious. So what also started happening about that time is Victor said, and you know, he had an idea of what kind of personality I had, and I had an idea of what kind of personality he had. And he said, can I come on one of your prayer retreats? A retreat that we did at Ruah Center at the Villa de Mattel. And I said, I just kind of scratched my head and thought, you know, this is going to be silent for 6 hours. And I'm just weighing this, you know, like, do I want to subject him to that? And do I want to subject the other people to... And so I said, sure, you know, come try it. And Victor just jumped right in. And the next thing I know, every time we go to Ruah Center, Victor's signed up. And not only has he signed up, but he's starting to bring friends. And so to see from those early days just the beautiful way that he started planting some roots, and didn't lose his personality, and didn't lose, you know, as when you're growing spiritually and you begin to dig roots, you don't lose who you are, you begin to find more of who you are. And that really began to happen. I noticed it with Victor when, so that's the untold part of that. And so I've had, you know, a real upfront first row seat to a lot of what's happened in Victor's life through these years. So I'm grateful for that. When you checked in, I hope you got a handout that has some psalms, some poetry in it. If you don't have that, there's some at the check-in table. We'll use a little bit of that this evening and kind of as we go, when we come back from breaks and some of those things. So the first thing I'd like for us to do is the very first psalm on page 1, kind of at the top of the page, a responsive version of Psalm 136. And I will offer the prayer, and then we'll just pause briefly for a moment, kind of a couple of pregnant seconds, and then the response that we will make at the end of each line, designated by the R, is at the top of the page. So after the pause for just a moment, I will say God, and then we'll all say, your mercy holds everything, always and everywhere. And that will be our response together. Okay? So we'll let this continue to lead us into the evening tonight. God, we offer thanks to you. Thanks for who you are, and thanks for what you do. God, your mercy holds everything, always and everywhere. Thanks for standing over everything we hold dear and over every working of the universe. God, your mercy holds everything, always and everywhere. You create all things consistent with your design for the world, continually shaping according to your mercy and shalom. God, your mercy holds everything, always and everywhere. You spread out the waters of the seas and scatter the lights in the sky. You mold the hills and trace out the river valleys. God, your mercy holds everything, always and everywhere. And you shape humans, each of us, as we become who you created us to be. God, your mercy holds everything, always and everywhere. You heal our brokenness. You release us from our self-centeredness. You mend our separateness, and you bring together what we have torn apart. God, your mercy holds everything, always and everywhere. You see us when we fly high, you join us when we fall low, and you deliver us from our own sideways intentions. God, your mercy holds everything, always and everywhere. I offer my thanks to you, and we offer our thanks to you. Thanks for who you are, and thanks for what you do. God, your mercy holds everything, always and everywhere. Amen. And then I want to offer a psalm that's on page 6, and I'll just offer this as a prayer of attentiveness. It comes out of Psalm 8, which would be familiar to you, I imagine, if you were to read it in one of the traditional translations. This is my way of envisioning Psalm 8 on page 6. God, everywhere I look, everything I see has the mark of your love. Your greatness and glory fill the universe. Your reach goes beyond the farthest planet, extends far past the faintest star. I'm in awe of you. Babbling babies praise you, and learned women acclaim you. Those suffering underneath the difficulties of life know your strength, and those sinking in the depths of grief know your peace. Nothing we face is larger than you. You paint glory on the canvas of the heavens, the moon and stars exactly what you need them to be. Women and men, too, are your works of art, divine poetry written out in the life of the world. You piece us together, creating us syllable by syllable, word by word, line by line, stanza by stanza, until we're complete, a lyrical, dancing symbol of your magnificence. As trees praise you by being trees, and animals praise you by being animals, so our human lives praise you as we come fully alive in you, as we live deeply and authentically connected to you, divine poetry enlivening the world. You invite us, God, to be fully alive. And our response is to say yes with our lips and yes with our lives, to offer ourselves to you in such a way that our love tells the world that you are love. Amen. And then the last thing I want us to read, take a look at, is on the last page, on the very back, page 16. A poem by Denise Levertov called A Traveler. And I have the sense that we might be able to sort of enter into this poem tonight, enter into this way of traveling that Denise Levertov lays out for us. If it's chariots or sandals, I'll take sandals. I like the high prow of the chariot, the daredevil speed, the wind, a quick tune you can't quite catch. But I want to go a long way, and I want to follow paths where wheels deadlock. And I don't want always to be among gears and horses, blood, foam, dust. I'd like to wean myself from their strange allure. I'll chance the pilgrim sandals. I like Denise Levertov's poem because she talks about a journey, and all the things in poetry that are unspoken but are right beneath the surface. She's talking about a journey and different ways of traveling, different ways of making a journey, whether it's an actual journey. There are not many of us in the room who would make many of our journeys by sandals these days. But she's talking about a way of traveling spiritually. A way that's, in another metaphor we might say, in a way that opposes a kind of microwave spirituality, a kind of chariot spirituality that gets you to the destination quickly. And she's speaking about going the long way, plodding the long, slow, messy steps that you have to take through the dust in your sandals to get to a destination. And you'll notice that at one point in the poem she says, "But I want to go a long way." You know, you go fast in a chariot for a little while, but she says, "I want to go a long way." The journey's a long one. The spiritual journey sometimes is slow and long and messy, but the way we travel is with a kind of mindfulness, with a kind of attentiveness to the moment that doesn't just speed along and leave everything else behind, but rather, and it doesn't deny everything else that's around us, but rather it begins to include everything that we are and everything that's around us. And I think she gets at that pretty well in her poem. So from time to time after breaks, and when we start up again tomorrow, maybe at the end of our time this evening, we'll do some psalms and poetry. I think in some of those ways, the Psalms are important to me because in the early 1990s, when I decided, just by kind of a circumstance, that I decided as a pastor that I needed to know how to pray. And I'd gotten by a lot of years as a pastor not knowing how to pray. I mean, I could stand in front of behind the pulpit or behind the lectern and lead a prayer and say a prayer on behalf of other people, and it'd be just fine and beautiful and all that. But in terms of having a life of prayer, I didn't have one. In terms of being deeply connected with God when I was in my own room or sitting in my own chair in my home or in my own office, I didn't have that. And the place I began was by praying psalms. And so the psalms that we've prayed this evening and some of the ones that are in the books that Victor mentioned came out of my own explorations in prayer and just beginning the only place I knew to begin. And then later I came to poetry kind of slowly. I'm the last person who would be a candidate in the room to read poetry. But a couple of poems found me about 22 years ago and began to change the way that I saw myself, saw the world, saw other people. And so psalms and poetry have been really important. I'll just say as kind of an aside, and those of you who have maybe were here last year or know me a little bit, over the last 5 or 6 years, as I've read poetry and I've been invited to do retreats for other groups and outside places, people would call and say, well, what do you have that you could lead us, that you could do for a retreat? And I would always pitch poetry as the first thing. You know, I want to do a poetry retreat. I want to just have a retreat where for a couple of days, 2 or 3 days, we just read poetry together and then talk about it. And talk about how it stirs the soul. And usually the reaction was, do you have anything else you could do? And so, you know, okay, that's fine. About 6 months ago, had some ladies call me and said, we want you to do a retreat, let's have a conference call, talk about what you can do. So I brought out my poetry spiel again. And I said, well, here's something that I've always wanted to do. And they said, we love it, we want to do that. This is a group that would love to do that. And so about 3 weeks ago in Louisiana, I got to lead a retreat where for 3 days we read poetry together. And we'd read a poem and then we'd talk about it. And this, it just lit people up. It was so fun to be able to do that and to have some poems in front of us from writers, different writers from different generations that began to speak to the soul. And really, reading poetry for me is an exercise in learning to be attentive to what's stirring within me. What's the line here that stirs me? David White says, when you read a good line in a poem, there's something in you that stirs to life, just like Lazarus who raises up his hands and walks out of the tomb. And that's the beauty of a good poem or a line of scripture that all of a sudden captures you, or a line from the Psalms, or something that a speaker might say. So we're going to talk a little bit this evening about that kind of listening and that kind of attentiveness that may be helpful for us. The first thing I want you to do, just right there, right now, for just a moment, this isn't an assignment so much, as I want you to give attention to 3 questions that you can answer for yourself. You can write it on a piece of paper, write it in your journal. If you want to take one of the papers that are at your table and just write a phrase or one sentence to each one of these prompts. Okay? 3 things for you to, and you're not going to share this with anybody else. We're not going to do table sharing or any of that. This is just for you. This is a way for you to kind of enter into what we're doing this evening. So the first question is, what do you love most about where you are right now? In one phrase or one sentence, what do you love most about where you are right now? Now that may be where you are in life, where you are at that table tonight, where you live. You can interpret where you are right now any way you want to interpret it. There's no right or wrong way to interpret that. What do you love most about where you are right now? In one phrase or one sentence. And no rush, but when you finish with that, the next one, what do you love most about what you're doing right now? Again, however you want to interpret that. If it's what you're doing at that table at this moment, if it's what you're doing in a larger sense of where you are in life, what you're doing in this season of your life, however you want to interpret that, in a phrase or a sentence, what do you love most about what you are doing right now? And when you're ready for the third, no rush again, what do you love most about who you are right now? What do you love most about who you are right now? And then when you finish with those three, I invite you just in the silence to make some kind of gesture, or maybe a silent whispered expression of thanks, or a gesture that expresses some kind of how you feel about what you've just put on paper. Okay? You might touch your head, or touch your mouth, or touch your heart. You might whisper a word of thank you, thanks to God in the silence. Some gesture, some silent word that represents how you feel about what you've written. Thank you, God. Your mercy holds us always and everywhere. Amen. Teach us to pray, the disciples said, as John taught his disciples. Teach us to pray. When Victor and I had conversation and we talked about this as kind of a frame for what we were going to do for these 2 days, I agreed to it, and then I started thinking, wow, that's really presumptuous that a bunch of people are going to come together and somebody's going to teach us to pray. The disciples come to Jesus and they say, teach us to pray as John taught his disciples. These disciples have watched Jesus. They've seen that he goes apart to pray from time to time. They've seen how he prays and seen what he prays, and they want in on the secret. They want in on kind of the key to how that goes. I have the sense that they probably assume, as many of us assume, and I think it's one of the hindrances to prayer, frankly, that many of us experience, that they probably assume that there's some secret key, some kind of like Gnostic secret, that if we only learn that, then we'll know how to pray. If somebody would just tell me this. And so I found through the years that many people who are inclined toward a deeper life with God or a more intentional spirituality are reading a lot of books and going to a lot of conferences and going to prayer retreats and all this, trying to find a secret so that makes prayer easy. And I don't think such a thing exists. And so I don't think Jesus makes it easy for them. He doesn't respond in a way that says, well, just do it. Here's the secret. And if you just get this, then you're going to get it. We tend to be very Gnostic in our thinking that way. That we have the sense that there are some people who do this well, or some people who do it right, whatever doing it right is. And if I could only do it the way they do it, then I'd be okay. The reality is, as Denise Levertov says, this is often long, slow, messy work, and it's a long journey, okay? And nobody gets it right. But what we're trying to do is come to some sense of our own practice, some sense of our own deepening connection with God, and trying to find the ways that work for us, the ways that help us to connect more deeply with God, so that our lives can be rooted and planted in who God is. So I don't want to be presumptuous and want you to think in any way that I'm going to give you keys for how to pray, that I'm going to teach you how to pray. What I do want to do is reshape some of our definitions, and I want to talk about prayer in some different ways, and I also want to talk about prayer in the wider context of spiritual practices. So we're doing this conference right here at the beginning of Lent, as we did it last year. And Victor is very intentional about wanting us to have some sense of how we're going to step in to life as we experience Lent, but then even beyond Lent, what is it that we do at Lent that can carry over into life? Now, I've been in this place that you've been in. You come to Ash Wednesday, and sometimes without a whole lot of thought, you say, oh, what am I going to do for Lent? Oh, it's Ash Wednesday. Oh, what am I going to do? Well, I did chocolate last year. I gave up chocolate. So this year I could do wine, but that leaves margaritas still in the mix. That would be good. And I could, so we work all this out and we do all the gymnastics, and we say, well, I could fast the way that I drive to work. I could say, I'm not going to drive on the Beltway to work. I'm going to take the residential streets. It's going to take me 20 minutes longer, but that's what so we do all of these things. We do. And I'm not demeaning or belittling any of that, but then we kind of sigh this big sigh of relief on Easter and say, oh, I get to drink wine again. Oh, I can have a piece of chocolate again. And it's just so wonderful. And giving up wine for Lent is nice, or giving up chocolate, or giving up, whatever it is, some kind of fasting. But my sense is, at least as I've experienced those things, none of that really touches who I am at the deepest part of my being. It's kind of a nice practice for Lent, but it never really made much of a difference for me. So I want us to explore tonight and tomorrow, as we talk about prayer and we talk about spiritual practices, some ways of engaging that might help us both to let go of some things, but then to spend our energy in some different ways, in some ways that aren't just meaningful for Lent, but are kind of meaningful for a lifetime, for this long walk, this long journey that Denise Levertov kind of describes for us. I want to explore prayer and spiritual life together because I think we've kind of spun out of control in terms of our thinking about spiritual practice. And I'm not saying those of us who are in this room and those of us who are interested in these things, but in many ways the church, capital C. And whenever I use the church, I'm most always this weekend going to refer to the church with a capital C, which is the church universal, the Catholic Church, which is universal everywhere, not the Roman Catholic Church. So I'm not talking about Memorial Drive Methodist, or I'm not talking about whatever church your church is, but church, capital C. So when we can gather as 80 or 90 people in a room and begin to talk about spiritual practices and talk about prayer, 80 or 90 people, that doesn't sound like much. But we each begin to do this in our world, where we live and move and have our being, where we work, where we sleep, where we eat our meals. We begin to do this where we are, and it begins to change the world where we are. So the intention, I think, that Jesus has to change the world is not by some big cosmic, message in the clouds that everybody in the world sees. It's his invitation to you and to me in changing our world is to change the world that you live in and I live in. The place where I live, the place where you live. That's the world, okay? That's the world over which I have some influence and the world over which you have some influence. So that's what we want to explore. These disciples asked Jesus, teach us to pray. And he tells a couple of enigmatic stories. But I think the heart of his teaching is to say, there's no secret. He doesn't really give them a method. He does give them the Our Father, but he doesn't really give them a method. But what he does do in verse 9 of Luke 11 is say, here's kind of how you need to go about this. Here's the stance that you need to take. And he uses these three words, which in the Greek are continual action. Ask, seek, and knock. Keep asking, keep seeking, keep knocking. Now, kind of in my Baptist upbringing years ago, what we would do when we were praying was saying, God, we're really seeking you today, and we're seeking you, and we're really knocking. And we'd tell God how much we're seeking and how much we're knocking, whether we really were or not, but we would just say that because in that context, prayer was all about the words you say. Okay? But if you pay attention to these three, asking, seeking, and knocking, there's only one that has anything to do with words. Only the first one. Keep asking. It's right to ask. It's okay that prayer is verbal, that prayer involves saying your prayers. Now, the problem is sometimes we hear people say your prayers as if that's the only way to pray. We keep asking. It's the only one of the three that's verbal. It represents kind of making petitions, making our prayer intercessory prayer, which may or may not be words that you recognize, but petitions, kind of praying for yourself, intercessory prayer, praying for someone else on behalf of someone else. So keep asking. Yes, keep asking. But then he says, keep seeking. Seeking has very little to do with what you say. Seeking has to do with the stance of your life, with what you're doing. Seeking is actional. Seeking has to do with having a spirit of exploration. You're looking for something. You're on a quest. Well, what are you seeking? Is one of the questions I would ask. Well, what you're seeking in this kind of stance that Jesus commends to us, you're not seeking gifts from God and favors from God. You're seeking God, God's self. That's what we're seeking. We're seeking a deepening connection with God. So it's as if Jesus is saying, don't be satisfied with your experience of God as it is. There's always more. There's always more to explore. There's always more to find. There are more depths. Keep seeking. Keep seeking what heals. Keep seeking what reconciles. Keep seeking what mercies. Keep seeking what compassions. And then he says, keep knocking. If seeking is kind of a spirit of exploration, that is looking for something, I think knocking speaks to a spirit of persistence, staying at it, not quitting, of this ongoing conscious contact. The idea of knocking at a door, at a closed door, and we often use the image of door when we say something like, well, that door closed to me, or that door opened to me. And so the image of a door, of knocking on a door, has something to do with discernment, doesn't it? So how do I know as a person in relationship to God, how do I know how long to keep here knocking here at this door and just keep on knocking? Or does there come a time when I say, you know, this door hasn't opened for a long, long time. It's time to knock on this door. Okay? So there's this spirit of perseverance, but there's also the spirit of discernment. How do I have the wisdom to know when to go to the next door and knock? And then what do I do when the door opens? Sometimes we can knock a long, long time and the door never opens. And we find sometimes in retrospect that we've been knocking at the wrong door all along. We should have moved on to another door. Okay? Now there's no secret for how to know what that time is. You just have to have some persistence and then have the courage sometimes just to go to the next door. Wisdom and discernment in the knocking. But in all of that, Jesus doesn't share secrets or keys to prayer. He talks about prayer as a stance. Or what I want to do is this weekend talk about prayer as a way of being. So that prayer includes saying prayers, but it also includes a way of being with God and for God in the world. Prayer is a way of being with God and for God in the world. I think Jesus in this passage doesn't describe prayer as much as an act as he does as a way of being, as a stance and a posture, a way of being in conscious contact with the divine. Prayer is a way of being with God and for God in the world, being rooted in God in the world. And that takes prayer out of this kind of privatized sense that prayer is just what happens within me, and it moves it out to how we carry it into the world. Being with God, you can be with God in your prayer room, in your chair where you pray at home, in the kitchen while you're cooking, wherever you do that work in the chapel here at Memorial Drive. But then how are you for God in the world? That's a part of your prayer too. Okay? Embodying God's presence where you go in the world. Okay? So I want to talk about three basic movements in prayer, three things that are all a part of prayer that form kind of a progression, a way of thinking about the totality of prayer. I'm sure there are more than three of these, but these three are pretty easy to pick up on, and you may be able to resonate with one, two, or maybe all three of them. Most all of us begin with a sense that prayer is monologue. Prayer is what I say to God. So in the church my wife and I attend in Arkansas, last fall, there's a children's lesson. The children come forward and somebody leads the children's lesson. And that week, the children's lesson is about prayer. And so the person teaching the children about prayer said, do you all know how to pray? Today we're going to learn how to pray. So everybody put your hands together. And everybody bow your head. And now everybody close your eyes. And this is how we pray. And my grandchildren had come to church with us that day, and so I had walked, Paula sings in the choir, and I had walked with them up to take them to the children's lesson and was sitting on the front pew, and I'm sitting there going, because the next week I'm starting a class on prayer at the church, and I'm going to say, you know, that's really not, that's a place to begin, but that's not a place to stay in prayer. And we've still got adults who think, you know, this is how this happens. And so, yeah, I got pretty queasy. But it's a place to begin. So this is the beginning place of prayer. Prayer is what I say to God. I talk, God listens. I talk to God. But that is just a beginning place. After prayer is monologue, there is prayer as dialogue. God talks, I listen. I talk, God listens. We're in dialogue. Now, this kind of prayer begins to move from ear listening to heart listening. There's a movement in this dialogue where we're not only listening for what we hear with our ears, but we're listening with our hearts. I've got a section in that Spiritual Foundations workbook that Victor showed you a while ago, all about this kind of heart listening. The Hebrew word for listening with the heart is to have a leb shomea, a heart that listens. And to have a heart that listens means that I'm hearing things with my heart, not just with my ears, not just filtered through my mind, but I'm hearing with this deeper part of my being. I'm listening for those things that kind of stir me and rumble down here within. There's one of the early church fathers, actually the quote's on page 13 in your handout, from Theophan the Recluse. Wouldn't you like to have that name? Be known as the recluse? You know, you've hidden away all the time. So Theophan says, and he's in the 3rd or 4th century, and he's describing what it means to pray on page 13, right there in the middle. You must descend from your head into your heart. At present, your thoughts of God are in your head. And God himself is, as it were, outside you. And so your prayer and other spiritual exercises remain exterior. Whilst you are still in your head, thoughts will not easily be subdued, but will always be whirling about like snow in winter or clouds of mosquitoes in summer. That's a pretty vivid image for the thoughts. But primarily what Theophan says is that this is the beginning of prayer. This is the beginning of this listening prayer when our head begins to descend into our hearts. We begin to hear with the ear of our hearts and not just with the ear of our minds. So prayer in this part where God speaks, I listen, I speak, God listening, that listening is not so much analysis. It's not picking apart and interpreting what we hear God say, but rather it's listening with the ear of our heart to what stirs us. Sometimes the way that I would say it is listen for what seems to have your address on it. You can listen to scripture that way. You can listen to poetry that way. You can listen to a sermon that way. You can read devotional material that way. What is the word? What is the phrase? What is the line? What is the image here that stirs me? And you just stop and you attend to that. Now, this is one of the ways that God speaks to us and we listen. Eugene Peterson, who was a Presbyterian pastor before he passed away a year or so ago, always said, all prayer is answering speech because God always has the first word. God's always speaking to us first, and when we speak to God, we're speaking in response to what God has already said to us. Okay? So in this kind of prayer as dialogue, we're learning to listen. We're learning what it means to listen. So one of the ways that we do this is what I call praying with Scripture, or Victor may be calling it Lectio Divina, and so that's the kind of the traditional Latin phrase for this kind of listening heart, way of listening to the Scriptures. So you read a passage of Scripture and you're noticing the word, the phrase, the image, the line that stirs you, that has your address on it. You're not trying to interpret it. You're not trying to analyze it. You're not trying to figure it out. What does this mean? Okay, you're getting back into the head. As soon as you start asking, what does it mean questions, you're back in your head. But remember, we're letting our head descend down into our heart so that we're listening with a different part of us. Sometimes in this kind of listening prayer, if you have a hard time sort of imagining your heart listening, you can imagine your body listening. I've read poetry, or I've read a piece of poetry, or read a passage of Scripture at particular times in my life, and all of a sudden I had a bodily reaction to something in it, for positive or for negative. Okay. So sometimes it could be kind of a bodily, but you're getting out of your head into a different part of your being. So you're attending to words, phrases, and images. You're listening for what stirs you, what has your address on it. And you're asking questions like, what is God's invitation here for me? Now I think we'll talk about, here in a few minutes, we'll talk about some touch points, and I didn't include this as one of them, but I could easily have said, God most always works with us through invitation and not through compulsion. God compelled me to do that, or God coerced me, God forced me. But God is always inviting. And the inviting, you could say, God is always wooing. Okay? So what is the invitation here? What is God wooing me to do or to undertake? So we're not analyzing, but we're receiving. And the assumption is that God always has this first word. God is always speaking to us. So that's one way of this, one practice that kind of moves us into this pattern of listening. Another practice is what I call prayer of awareness, what Victor may call an examen of consciousness, which is what the church calls this. So we're becoming aware, we're listening to our life. When you listen to your life, you're doing what the Quakers talk about this a lot. Let your life speak. Listen to your life. Listen to what your life is telling you. And so you simply ask yourself a couple of questions. Where have I experienced life, love, and energy in the last 24 hours or in the last week, whatever the period of time is? What has given me life and love and energy? What's excited me? When did I feel like I was swimming with the current of my life? You recognize, don't you, if you've done some swimming at the ocean or in swift rivers, swimming, there's a huge difference in swimming with the current and swimming against the current. And we'll talk about some Ignatian spirituality, Ignatius of Loyola, tomorrow. But Ignatius has this big idea that, and actually Ignatius came up with this kind of prayer method, this kind of listening method. And he says, you know, what we really want to be doing is finding those ways that we can swim with the current of our life, what God has placed within us, what God has created us to be and created us to do. And that when we're swimming with the current of our life, we have energy. Not that it's easy, but that we're not coming up against all the resistance when we swim upstream. And so the second question is, when and where have I felt the absence of love? life being drained out of me? When have I felt myself swimming upstream? So this prayer of awareness is just, you could just do it in this kind of twofold sort of way, two sets of questions. What's giving me life, love, and energy over this period of time? And I'll have some sense of where I'm swimming with the current. Now, it's a little more nuanced than that, but this is a place to begin. And on the other hand, where am I swimming upstream? Okay? So these are two ways. This is a way of listening to your life. We're talking about prayer as dialogue, and we're trying to cultivate some deeper ways of listening. The third movement in prayer, we've talked about monologue and dialogue. The third movement of prayer is what I'd call prayer as communion. If monologue is talking to God, and dialogue is talking with God, where there's this reciprocal talking and listening going on, then communion is being with God where no words are necessary. Just as you can sit quietly with someone you love and not have to say a bunch of words, and sometimes the words just get in the way, you can sit quietly and just be with the beloved. So in this form of prayer, with God, you can be with God as communion, being with, being present to, being mindful of. And so our contemplative Christian tradition gives us some of these prayer forms that help us move into that, things like centering prayer or Christian meditation. These ways of resting in God's presence. Now, the beautiful thing about prayer as communion is that it's transportable. It goes with you wherever you go. If you have this sense that God is with me, that I'm with God, that I don't have to be talking to God all the time, then you can have that sense of being in prayer when you're in a meeting in the boardroom, or when you're in conversation with someone else at a meal, whatever you're doing. It's a transportable form of prayer because you're aware that God is with me, that I'm with God, that I'm present to God, God is present to me, and we don't need words to try to explain that. It's a prayer of being. So there's this, I'm teaching a Sunday school class 3 weeks ago. And I'm talking about some of these ways of prayer, and I'm talking about prayer as communion. I hadn't taught in this class in the year and a half that we've been in this church, so a lot of these people are new to me. I'm talking about prayer as communion, of being with God. And Jim, in the Sunday school class, I'm talking and I just look at him, and all of a sudden, he looked like he was kind of dozing off, and all of a sudden he's alive, and I just kind of paused to see if he wanted to say anything, and he said, "Now I get it." And somebody said, "Jim, what did you get?" Nobody knew what it was. And he said, and he told this story there, and this is the story he said. He talked about Dan Rather interviewing Mother Teresa years ago. And Dan Rather asked Mother Teresa what she said in her prayers. And she said, "I listen." And Dan Rather said, "Well then, if you're listening, what does God say?" And she said, "He listens." And Jim said, Dan Rather was all flummoxed at that. He didn't get it. And Mother Teresa said, "And if you don't understand that, I can't explain it to you." And Jim in Sunday school told that story, and he said, "I remember that from a long time ago, but I never knew what that meant. And this morning, I see what that meant." A sense of just being present to God. Well, what are you doing? I'm listening to God. What's God doing? He's listening to me. Okay? These are the touch points. We'll take a break right after we talk about these. These are kind of what I see as kind of some big overarching, framework or structure on which some of these things hang, I think. And I think they hang pretty reliably here. And many of them happen to be things that in the church, for those of us who've been in the church a while, we haven't heard some of these things a lot, especially for some of us when we were growing up. The first one is, you cannot be closer to God than you already are. Now, I don't know about you, but that runs totally counter to what I was ever taught. I didn't grow up in my young years in the church, but I got there as quick as I could, like they say about Texas. So in my adolescence, in high school, came to the church. But I didn't hear that. The message I heard was that if I was good, I could be close to God, or if I had a good prayer life, I could be close to God, or if I did this, or if I did that, I could be close to God. But there was always some condition in that conditioned God's proximity to my behavior or my belief, okay? You cannot be closer to God than you already God. God's nearness or proximity to you is not based on what you do, what you say, or what you believe. Not dependent on any of that. God has already made the decision to be in you and with you. And there's nothing you can do or say or believe that's going to change that on God's end. Now, what that means is that because some of us carry those tapes within us, something has to shift within us. And one of the things in prayer and spiritual practice that has to shift is our capacity to be aware of God's proximity to us. Because we've lived so long with those tapes that if I misbehave or if I misspeak, if I happen to drop a word I shouldn't drop, or if I, whatever it is, then I'm going to chase God away. So we are the ones who have to have some kind of interior shift at that point. This is kind of a corollary to the one before. God is present always in time and everywhere in space. And I just say it this way. This moment is holy. This moment is holy. Right now, this moment, because all moments are holy. God is always. And this ground is holy, not because it's Memorial Drive Methodist Church. This ground is holy because all ground is holy. God is in every place. God is always in time and everywhere in place or space. Okay? God is always and everywhere. Now, Teresa of Avila said, and Victor's already quoted her this evening, in the 16th, 17th century, the problem most people have in prayer is that they pray as if God were absent. It's kind of like we're shooting our prayers out there hoping they hit something, but we're not really sure God is always and everywhere. Okay? So if we kind of internalize this, if we let this get into us, then it changes the way we pray. It changes our spiritual practice. Okay? It's the old a hope in a prayer or a wing in a prayer, kind of is that sense that I'm going to shoot some things out there and I just hope something hits. Some of us have sort of the impression that from time to time in our life, God shows up. Oh, God showed up there. Or, yeah, God was there at that event or at that thing. And, my response to that is, yeah, God was there at that thing, but God was there before that thing, and God was there after that thing, and God did not just show up for that thing. God is always and everywhere. Now, this sounds real basic. It sounds real fundamental. But most all of us have old tapes that counter that speak against that. And this is a huge hurdle for us to get over. But I think you can probably see that it's a huge hurdle that if we can get over this, it's going to shift our prayer. It's going to shift our spiritual practice. Okay? Because we're no longer begging God to be present to us. I've done that. You've done that in prayer. God, please be present with me. When I go to work, it's going to be a tough day today. I'm going to have this meeting with so-and-so, and I don't want to face him or her, whoever it is. Please be present with me. Well, that's okay, to pray the prayer. Whether you pray the prayer or not, the reality is God was already going to be there. And if God wasn't there, the problem was, if you have the sense that God wasn't there, the problem is not that God wasn't there, but that you're not aware that God was there. I'm not trying to work this in a word puzzle, but, okay? So again, that's why we're going to work on our awareness, our attentiveness to God's presence. The spiritual life, this is the third touch point. The spiritual life is about union, connection, and oneness. For centuries, I'm not making this up. This isn't just Jerry saying this right here. For centuries, the goal of the Christian spiritual life has been union with God. You can go back and read it. You can read it beginning with Jesus in John 17. You can read it in all of the early church writings. The goal of the Christian spiritual life is union with God. Being in Christ, Paul says. That's how the Apostle Paul says it. Be in Christ. Union. Be one with Christ. God's desire for the God-human relationship is this union, connection, and oneness. That is, and this is my paraphrase of that, God wants persons to be whole. That is, fully the person God created you to be, and holy. Be whole and holy. Whole, the person, fully the person God created you to be, and holy, that is, fully living in rhythm and oneness with God, self, others, and the world. So there is an inward dimension to this and an outward dimension to it. It's tending the inner fire so that then we have something to take into the world. Fully living in rhythm and oneness with God, ourselves, others, and the world. Okay? This isn't just about my personal spiritual life, your personal spiritual life. Now, some of it's about that, but it's also about how you take that into all the places you live and move and have your being, wherever you do your life. How do I do my life differently in my workplace, with my family? When I do my grocery shopping, when I go to the repair shop and get my car. All of those things, every interaction we have, every way that we treat the creation. This is the kind of transformation we're talking about. So this union, connection, and oneness is all about putting together, not separating and dividing. Okay? That's what union is. Bringing together. The church, capital C, has a history for a lot of centuries dividing. Most all denominations. Methodists are going through that now. Back in my day, I was a Baptist when that was happening among Baptist churches in the United States. I said to somebody, it's happening among Quakers. God forbid, I thought Quakers I thought they were getting it right. And then I learned a few months ago that the Quakers are having their own struggles. So this division and this separation, and God's desire for God's children, for the human family, is union and oneness and connection. Not alienation and separation. This is what the spiritual life is. So we're trying to put things together, not tear things apart. Okay, that's a touchstone. That's just kind of a basic touchstone. Grace, mercy, and extravagance. Now, you can probably find somebody somewhere who said this. I said that divine union for centuries has been the Christian contemplative, Christian spiritual goal of the spiritual life. You can find that in writings. I don't know that you can find this in writings. This is my idea. God's fundamental character is generosity. This is how I've come to experience God. Fundamentally, God is generous. That is graceful, merciful, and extravagant. That God is mostly known by generous self-giving. That is, God gives away God's self and is never diminished. God makes the rain fall on the just and the unjust, and God's no less for it. God sows seed wildly and extravagantly in the world, and the seed is never depleted with God. God is extravagantly self-giving. That means God is always spending on us, always spending on our world, and is never depleted. My phrase for that is, I think I used it last year here, we are but narrow-necked bottles at the very Niagara of grace. If the Niagara Falls were grace, and we've got our, I just want, if I could just get that much of it. And prayer, the spiritual life, is about taking more than a little narrow-necked bottle to the Niagara of grace. That's what spiritual practices are about. That's what prayer is trying to do within us. To be able to catch more of this extravagant self-giving that's at the heart of who God is, always and everywhere. Another touchstone. Our human response to God's generous initiative, to God's self-giving in the world, is at least threefold. And these are just three pretty easy ones. First of all, to be attentive to it. To be attentive, that is to see it more and more regularly in our lives and in the world. That's part of the role that prayer and spiritual practices play. To be attentive to it, to be open to it, that is open to it so that we receive it. We're not just seeing it out there, we're not just seeing it in other people or in the world, but open to it so that I receive it too. And to participate in it, that is not just for me to receive it, but for me to carry it to other people. Okay? So I see it, I open myself to it, I receive it, and then I carry it into the world. I participate in it. Okay? Okay. We're at break time. We'll take about a 10-minute break, restroom, get some more water if you need water. We'll come back and talk a little bit more about spiritual practices as a part of prayer and set up some of the things that we'll talk about tomorrow morning when we gather tomorrow morning. So,
before we take a break, I just want to remind you, so we have Jerry's books over in the back table over there if you want to purchase one during your break. Also, we have some index cards there for you. So as Jerry's lectures are moving along, I'm sure there'll be some questions that may prompt at the moment that you're listening to something that may strike you. And if you have those questions, you can write them down, and then we're going to do a Q&A session with Jerry at the end of his lectures throughout the weekend.
And I just love Q&A.
I know he does. I know he does.
Please ask questions. Don't you, John? Don't you just love Q&A?
Thank you so much.
Victor loves Q&A.
Yeah.
That Victor does. So Victor will answer your questions.
I'll do that. I'll just whisper to him on the side. What do I say? Just right quick, one of the things that struck me about what he's talking about prayer being all the time available and being attentive to that voice, I'm in seminary, and seminary is rough, okay? And I was going through a season in one of my semesters that it was pretty tense. And so I was trying my best to be attentive to where does God want to place me with this tension that I had with this particular class. I've learned over the years, I go to my lifelines, and Jerry is one of them. So I text him right quick, and I just asked him a few questions. And when he replied, it wasn't because it was Jerry, but I knew that those words that he said to me at that moment was remaining attentive to what he's talking about, to God's voice, because that's exactly what I needed. And there's a phrase that I carry on in all these lectures that we do in this type of spirituality, is the anchoring, and that's what I was looking for. And so I don't think I would have been able to do that if I would have kept running with the story in my head where I was with this tension. But these lifelines helped me so much to listen to God's voice through that. And it was just that text that just kind of, I just remember reading it and afterwards going, yeah, this is it. This is what I'm looking for. And just anchoring into inner peace right after that. Of course, tension still begins, still at seminary because I haven't completed it. but Jerry is one of my lifelines, so I'm okay. Anyways, 10-minute break. Please enjoy it.
So I want to jump in a little deeper, give you some sense of what I think we're about in prayer and spiritual practices, and then we'll talk about it in some other ways tomorrow. I first heard this story from John Shea, who was a Jesuit-trained. He's a theologian, taught at Loyola University in Chicago for a long time. But he's also a storyteller, and he collects spiritual stories from around the world. And he told this at a workshop, summer workshop I attended at Loyola about a decade ago. And it's an ancient Near Eastern story about Jesus. And the story goes like this. Jesus was walking down a road between villages with his disciples. There were people kind of gathering on the sides of the road as Jesus walked, hearing that he was walking between the villages. And as Jesus was walking along, a man from the crowd spat on Jesus and began to curse him. And Shay didn't say this, but I imagine in our vocabulary it would be something like, "Damn you, Jesus, go to hell." Spat on him. And Jesus stopped, walked over to the man. You could just imagine that everything, what's he going to do? The disciples and the rest of the crowd. Jesus walks over to the man, places his hand on his forehead, the man's forehead, and says, "I bless you in the name of Almighty God," and then walks on down the road. They get to the village, into their room, in their private room, and one of the disciples, I've imagined, Shay didn't say this either, but I've imagined that it's Peter. One of the disciples says to Jesus, "Why did you bless him? He cursed you. He spat on you. Why did you bless him?" And according to the story, Jesus said, "I can only give what I carry in my purse." I can only give what I carry in my purse. Now, this is a huge insight. If you kind of get the import of what this says about Jesus, Jesus only has access to blessing because it's all that's within the purse of his self, his soul. So when the disciple asked, "Why didn't you curse?" Jesus has no capacity to curse. Cursing does not live within him to curse another human being. All he has in his purse, the purse of his self, is blessing. Now, I've used this story a lot lately with people that I've been in conversation with. People who have some difficulty with others that they work with or that they know in some way of life, and to encourage the people that I have talked with to say, you know, if someone is treating you badly or someone's difficult or if they're saying and doing difficult things to you, most all of us as humans can only give to someone else what we carry in our purse. It's also true for us. We can only give to others what we carry in our purse. I can only give to you in this kind of setting some of what I've tried to experience or some of what I've tried to be a part of, and you can only do that with me and with others in that same kind of way. When you think about people who bully or people who divide or people who wound others, if you could step back and say that person is only giving what he or she carries in their purse. It doesn't absolve from all blame, because there's some people who have willfully decided, this is all I'm going to carry in my dadgum purse, okay? So it's not absolving all blame, but it does carry with it the realization that any of us can only give to someone else what we carry in our purse. Just as Jesus gave what he carried in his purse, you and I give what we carry in our purse. Other people who think differently politically than we do, than you do, think different theologically, think different culturally, we all can only give what we carry in our purse. Psychologically, we can think about this same thing, and I want to lean into a poem to think about this from kind of the perspective of depth psychology. There's a poem on page 11 of your material by William Stafford. Down at the bottom of page 11. What the Middle Eastern story about Jesus images as a purse, Stafford in this poem images as a sack. And this is also, the sack is also an image that some psychologists use for this kind of phenomenon. So here's Stafford's poem, "It's heavy to drag this big sack." It's heavy to drag this big sack of what you should have done. And finally, you can't lift it anymore. Someone says, "Come on," and you just look at them. Trees are waiting, mountains. You never intended that it should come to this. But now has arrived and is looking straight at you the way a lion does when thinking it over, and anything can happen. It's time for the cavalry or maybe the Lone Ranger, but they won't come. Maybe the music will spill over and start it all again, maybe. Stafford uses this image of there's this sack that you carry of all the things you should have done, and maybe some of the things that you did do, right? Now, psychologically, in a kind of Jungian depth psychology, a sack is often imaged as what we carry through life. That all of us are born with a sack. And we come to 2 or 3 years old, and we begin to hear messages from people in our world, usually parents, grandparents, important people to us, people we look to. And they begin to say to us, "Don't do that. Good girls don't act that way. Little boys don't do that. You dress this way. You act this way. You play this. Oh, you don't play with that." And we begin to put things in our sack. The same happens through childhood. We begin to put other things in our sack. The message that say to us, "You're not very good at sports," put that in my sack. "You're not very creative, you're terrible at art," put that in my sack. "You ought to be this when you grow up," put that in my sack. I begin to carry this. Stafford, in the landscape of the poem, says, after a while, the sack gets so big you can't even pick it up. And then he images it as you've got this sack of your life right here that you can't even pick up, and it's like a lion's looking at you, ready to pounce, ready to have you for the meal, and you can't move. You're paralyzed because of all these things you stuffed in your sack. Psychology says that we can go a lifetime stuffing things in our sack and never take them out and begin to look at them. We do this through childhood. We especially do it as adolescents. You know, we want to be with this group, but not with this group. We want to look like those cool cats and not these. Well, cool cats, that dates me, doesn't it? Victor, back in the day, that's what we called. Yeah, those that have swag. That's you want to rep with those who have swag. Okay, yeah. I depend on my 30-something children to help me with that. Okay. So we continue doing this for a lifetime. We keep putting things in our sack. And part of the practice of prayer and spiritual discipline, spiritual practices, is that we come to a place and we begin to say, wait a second, I've got all these things in my sack that I've stuffed there for a lifetime that are driving my car, that are steering my ship, and I haven't even been aware that they're there. Now, we can keep on denying that they're there. We can say things like, oh, it's just who I am, right? It's just the way I am. It's just the way I do things. This is just the way I think. This is just the way I behave. You know, if you don't like it, get over it. But to do our spiritual work means that we become more and more attentive to what is within us. Now, you notice that in a couple of the touchstones a moment ago, there were 4 kind of realms that I said all of this touches, all of this kind of work touches. God, self, others, and the world. And the realm that's most difficult for most of us to touch with our spiritual work is the realm of self. Okay? All of us kind of have the sense that this has to do with God, and we're sort of excited about that. We're looking forward to that. And we have some other sense that it's going to make a difference with others and even in the world that we live in. But a whole bunch of us have never considered that this kind of transformation is going to touch myself. It's going to be the kind of work that causes me to either consider what I have in my purse, if you want to use the Jesus story, or the things that I put in my sack, if you want to use the poetic image, and say, what is this in my sack? And how is it driving my car? How is it steering my ship? Is it something that's giving life to me? Is it something that's giving life to my world? Or is it something that's stealing life from me? Now, I want to lay alongside that a passage of Scripture, and we're not going to read the whole passage. I'll just kind of tell you what's going on. It's the bound man of the Gerasene region in Mark 5, verses 1 through 20. This is the story that's called the demoniac story. The traditional translation says that the man is possessed by all the demons and he's living among the tombs in the cemetery, and he's so wild that the chains won't even hold him, and he keeps breaking the chains, and all the townspeople are fearful of him, and Jesus comes along and delivers him. And Jesus says to him, what is your name? And the man says, my name is Legion, for we are many. And all of the sermons that we've preached, and I've preached, and John's preached, everybody's preached about what a legion is, and this whole battalion, this big number of identities within this man. But this, in the gospel kind of landscape, the gospel is saying to us what the ancient story about Jesus says about the purse, and the poem says about a sack. That within this isn't just about a man in a cemetery somewhere. This is your story and my story. There are legions of us, legions within me, legions within you, every one of us without exception. And they have different kinds of pulls on us and influences on us. And again, they steer our ship, they guide our car, they drive us. And then the complicating thing in the story is that when Jesus delivers this man, then the townspeople see him sane, sitting insane, and they become afraid and say, get the guy out of here. We kind of, we knew we could tie him up and put him in the cemetery and, keep him away from us. But now that he's sane, we're not even sure what to do with a sane person. And my sense is that this man's newfound sanity threatened the rest of the people who still had legions within them. And my other sense is that this story in the Gospels may be telling us something that happened historically in a moment, but that for most of us to deal with the legions within us, it's going to take a lifetime. I don't know of anybody who has dealt with everything in their purse or everything in their sack or the legions within them in a moment in time. That this is the work that takes a lifetime to do, and this is the kind of spiritual work that we're engaged in. And it's why I said at the very outset tonight that this is long, slow, messy work. because we deal with, we pull one thing out of the sack, or we see one thing within our purse, or we deal with one of these legion, and we think, whew, glad that's over. I'm okay now. And then a week or so later, one of two things happens. Either one of the other legion pops up, or that same legion pops up and we say, oh no, I dealt with that last week. I thought I was over it. And it's back again. This is ongoing work. This is one of the reasons that we talk about in the spiritual life that we're never finished with it, and we want to really, really take away this kind of mystique that says that spiritual people are more holy than anybody else. The first impulse you have when you begin to do this work and deal with a part of that legion or something from your sack is the sense that, oh my, I didn't know this was within me. I'm a failure. Had I seen this all, I think that's probably why God doesn't show us all these things at once, the legion all at once. That God seems to be real gentle with us, very compassionate with us again, and sort of shows us one or two things at a time and says, Jerry, this is what we're going to work with right now. This is what we're working on. And, after we're finished with this, maybe we'll get a little break and then we'll work on something else. But we're not going to do it all at once, so you don't have to worry about that. But there just seems to be this sort of gentle way that God does it. But in no way do I have the sense that because we're doing this work, we're more holy than anybody else. Like I said, the sense that we have when we're in the midst of it is, oh, crap. This is within me. I had no idea. So, I live out this story every day. All the things I've stuffed into my sack for 61 plus years. And some of you are older and some of you are younger in the room. You don't deal with that quickly. For instance, I have all the falsity of my Enneagram. Victor said he's an 8. I think I'm a 1. All the falsity of the things that keep me kind of self-protected and closed in on myself, all the fears and the insecurities, and this legion of things within me. So I'm sitting in a small group a few weeks ago, kind of spiritual direction in a small group of people, and talking about some things going on and my own, tendency just to kind of close in on myself, high introvert, close in on myself, the exact opposite of Victor. And both of those things have their light and their shadow. And having someone in the group very lovingly say to me when, they're asking me questions, trying to draw things out of me, and I'm saying, well, it's just hard for me to get out and meet new people and all that. And somebody who very lovingly says to me, have you ever thought about taking your laptop to a coffee shop and just sitting there for a couple of hours and meeting people who walk in the door? And within my stomach, there's something that goes, no, never. And so that's we all have that kind of thing. Yours is probably different. Some of you I know feel the same way I do about that thing, but there are others of you who just love to do that. But your thing is something else. We all have this kind of legion, this metaphorical legion within us, this full sack. And spiritual practice, spiritual disciplines, prayer, part of the purpose of the spiritual life is to help us see these things about ourselves so that we can love and serve God, so that we can love ourselves, so that we can love others, so that we can be in the world in a healing, redeeming way. That's how we begin to step into this life. So prayer and spiritual practice kind of begin to go together and begin to help give us ways to deal with these things that are within us. What is the prayer and what are the practices that would allow me, for instance, to pull blessing from my purse instead of cursing? If we say, well, Jesus was only able to pull blessing from his purse, I don't imagine there's anybody else in the room who would be able to say, well, I only have blessing in my purse. Now, you bring the right person to you, and all of us have other options in our purses, don't we? Okay? So what are the spiritual practices that would help me to begin to identify what I have in my purse, or would help me to begin to give blessing instead of cursing? What is the prayer, what are the practices that would allow me to offer to someone else from my purse mercy instead of judgment? Love instead of fear? Compassion instead of distance? Healing instead of division or separation? Go back? Okay. Oh, I'm sorry, Joan. Now, my sense is, and I think I could back this up, that we cannot have a different purse or different things in our purse, or look honestly at what we have in our sack, or recognize the legion within us, if our religion or our spirituality is only a matter of belief, of what we believe. And the church, capital C again, for a lot of centuries, has said to us, at least in the West, that belief is the most important thing. What you believe is the most important thing. That's basically why denominations split. That's why Christians take their toys and go home. Because it's been about belief. The early church struggled with this, and that's why we say creeds on Sunday morning, because the church in the first 3 to 5 centuries had these theological debates about what was the correct belief. And the creeds that we say now on Sunday morning are the creeds that survived. That the church said, oh, this is really what we need to believe. You need to believe this. Okay? So, can I change it now, Joan? Thank you. I pick on you because I know I can. I read several years ago, and I don't have personal experience with this, so I'll lean into 2 people that I trust to have said this. Beatrice Brutto, who was a Jesuit Ignatian-trained philosopher and theologian, taught about the contemplative life, the contemplative Christian spirituality, wrote a series of articles about what the church in the West can learn from the church in the East. And one of the things that she says is that when you go into a church in the West, of which we're a part, the first question, or the primary question is, what do you believe? Go into a church, or even beyond the church, in some Eastern religious traditions, the first question is not, what do you believe? The question is, what is your practice? What is your practice? Richard Rohr, in his latest book, says the same thing in chapter 8 or 9. That his experience of going into a place in the East to go on retreat in a Buddhist retreat center, that the abbot of the Buddhist retreat facility asked him as soon as he arrived, and what is your practice, Father Rohr? Now, if you can see the huge difference between your belief and your practice, okay? Your belief lives here. Your belief is what makes you orthodox. So we talk about being orthodox. That is, being right, being standard, being appropriate. But we don't talk so much about orthopraxy. We talk about orthodoxy, not orthopraxy. Orthopraxy from praxis, which means practice. What is appropriate practice? Or what is the practice that's going to develop in my life, or going to develop in your life, the kind of person that God created me to be? Okay? So just believing doctrine, just believing a set of theological propositions does not get us there. But we have enough leaders in the church of different churches in the room, and clergy and pastors and all, who would say to us, just having right belief does not mean that anyone is transformed. Right belief does not transform. But spiritual practices begin to work on us from the inside. Now, what we have become is, by and large, a church of belief and not practice. Maybe you just need to take a picture, Joan. I told Victor, wait, no, I'm not just picking on you. I told Victor that I'll send him the PowerPoints and he'll make those available to you on the mailing list, okay? So you don't have to worry about all this. What practices, okay, questions like this. What practices open me to love? What practices help me deal with anger and hatred if that's in my sack? If those things are part of the legion within me? What practices help me deal with anger and hatred? What practices anchor me in a shifting world? I think that's a huge question right now. With the day, you read the news feeds, wherever you are politically, you can just get blown around every day. What practices anchor me in a shifting world, in a world that seems to change day by day? What practices make me more compassionate? What practices open me to God's love flowing in me and through me into the world? What practices help me let go of some of that which is I carry in my sack? What practices help me see the legion within me? What practices open me to the really real? What practices help me become the person God created me to be? Now, we'll talk tomorrow about some specific practices and some ways to step into this. My sense is that all this is shifting for each one of us, and the lists are not going to look the same for any one of us. There was a time that I taught years ago that if you want to kind of get in on this, what we're talking about tonight, then you really need to do some form of what I would have called contemplative prayer. Christian meditation, centering prayer, the Lectio Divina, praying with Scripture, or the prayer of awareness, and some of those things. You really need to do those things. I'm coming to sense that doesn't work for everyone. And that was probably obvious to some of you for whom it didn't work, and you still had to listen to me say you need to do this. So I'm much more willing than ever to say, find the practice that works for you, that helps you to see what's in your sack, that helps you to identify some of the legion within you, that helps you to see the truth about yourself, but not only about yourself, the truth about God, the truth about others, and the truth about the world. Okay? I think Richard Rohr says it something like, the practices that help you kind of slice through the illusions to get to what's true. Okay? So we all have to find what those things are for ourselves. My son is, he'll be 33 in a few weeks. And he's started listening to podcasts by Richard Rohr and by spiritual teachers. He's been around me forever, but now he's finally decided that it's time to listen to Richard Rohr, not Dad, which is fine. And because he's of a generation where he's got an app for everything, he's got a meditation app, kind of a breathing meditation, kind of a breath prayer app. And it's a different meditation every morning, and his practice right now is first thing in the morning, before he showers, he opens the app. Is that what you do with an app? You open the app, he opens his app, and he gets the breathing meditation or the breath prayer for that day, and he does it for about 7 minutes. And then he goes to take his shower, and he carries into his shower the breathing prayer, the breath prayer, the breathing meditation. And he does it while he's in the shower. And then he gets out and he gets dressed and he begins to get his kids up, my grandchildren, get them ready for school and do all that stuff. But he's now done this breathing meditation for about 15 minutes in the morning. And he says, and he's only talked to me about it once or twice, but he says, then in the middle of the day, because I've done it these 15 minutes in the morning, in the middle of the day, something happens. He's a junior high principal in Bentonville. Something happens during the day. A kid does something stupid. A parent comes in and reams him out for something. A teacher does something terrible. And he says, I bring the meditation back up. And it's right there because I've done it 15 minutes in the morning. And that's his practice right now. That's his practice to stay anchored in his world. A few months ago, I decided one of the things, I told you I'm pretty sure I'm an Enneagram 1, so that means if you know the Enneagram, I'm what they call a reformer. I want to make the world right. I want to keep the rules. It's a perfectionist, somebody who's a perfectionist. And I want to save the world. I want to do what's right and save the world. But my underlying issue is is that I'm really angry because I'm not. I want the world to be perfect and I want to be perfect, but I know I'm not perfect. And I'm mad at you because you're not perfect. And I'm mad at the world because it's not perfect. So anger is the underlying issue, but it's rooted in this desire for perfection. And so about 2 months ago, just sitting in my home on my hill in Arkansas, I say, what I need to do for a spiritual practice is I need to be engaged in something I'm not very good at and I'm never going to be good at, and I need to stick with it. I'm not going to do it and then quit it because I'm not good at it. I'm going to do it and I'm going to stick with it. And I'm going to let myself not succeed at something. And I made a little list of what some of those things would be. I've tried to garden for 2 years. The first year, got a lot of fruit and vegetables out of the garden and thought it was all me. Thought, this is easy. All you got to do is this, and this, and all this stuff comes up and you eat it and it's great. The second year got almost 0. And I realized, this isn't as easy as I thought it was. And that's one of the things. I said, I'm going to stay at this. I don't care. I'm probably never going to be good at it. I'm too old to get to all of a sudden be good at this. But I'm going to stick with it. And even if I don't succeed, and I've got a list of about 3 other things that I'm going to stick with, so that when this rises up within me that says, you really need to be angry, Jerry. In my sack it says, you need to be angry because you're not perfect. You need to be angry because you're not succeeding at this. I'm going to say, no, right here. I'm going to do something that I may fail at, and it's okay to fail. That's part of my spiritual practice. Taking something out of my purse and saying, wait, I'm going to take this thing out of my purse and hope I can replace, hopefully, the anger with something else to put in my purse, something else to put in my sack. Okay? Now, I'm not thinking anybody else in the room needs to take up gardening so that you can, get over your anger. That's what I'm trying to do. The point is for you to find whatever corresponds to what you have in your sack. Say, what do I need to do as a spiritual practice? What do I need to undertake as a part of my prayer? I just got reminded as I was doing that of Francis of Assisi, who prayed for 1 humiliation a day. And back when I read that in the early 2000s, I thought, wow, that's really cool. I'm going to try that. And I did that for a while, and I stopped real fast because you don't have to pray for a humiliation in order for humiliation to come. And the humiliation, like embarrassment, by the very nature of it, is always touching something tender in your ego. Because you want to show up and look like somebody who's got it all together, and then it kind of comes to light that you don't have it all together, like you really are a failure at gardening. and all of a sudden you feel humiliated or I'm so embarrassed. You don't have to, I'm just telling you, don't pray for a humiliation a day, just let them come. They're going to come, okay? So, but really, that's one of the ways Francis of Assisi, as he's dealing with what's in his purse, what's in his sack, the legion within him, he said, I need that. I need that to keep me connected with God. Otherwise, I'm going to get full of myself, and I don't want to be full of myself. This isn't about me. This is about God, okay? So these are the helpful spiritual practices that help me deal with these things. They help us see through the illusions to what is true about God, self, others, and the world. So if your spiritual practice is painting, if it's singing, if it's walking, if it's watching birds, if it's chasing butterflies, if it's visiting a refugee family, if it's going to an interfaith service, if it's singing Just As I Am on Sunday morning, if that's what does it for you, then do that. Okay? So all the books on spiritual practices, you can read them, some of them are helpful, but you could just throw them out too, because you have to find what works for you. What helps you live honestly with God, self, others, and the world in a way that's life-giving for you and for others? Okay. This is kind of homework, something to think about before tomorrow that I'll leave with you. Either late tonight before you go to bed or early in the morning when you get up and have your coffee. And again, we're not going to share this at the table, so you don't have to worry about, I don't want to say this. This is just for you. What is something you do regularly that cultivates compassion within you? Is there some, and it doesn't have to be like a typical spiritual discipline, or it doesn't have to seem spiritual, but it may be gardening, or it may be singing, or it may be writing poetry. It may be going to another part of town and being around people who look different than you. What do you do regularly that cultivates compassion within you? You don't have to make a long list. Just if one thing or maybe two things come to mind, just jot it down. What practice are you engaged in that helps you to slow? Gerald May has this phrase in one of his books, The Wisdom of Wilderness, where he talks about the power of slowing. I'm aware, having been out of Houston for 2 years, every time I come back, I just feel like I'm getting run over everywhere I turn. My plane got in Tuesday night, and I'm driving to Joe and Carol's house at 9:30 at night, and I'm getting run over on the Beltway. At 9:30. At 9:30 at night in my neighborhood, the lights have been out for an hour. There's nothing going on. All that's out at 9:30 are the deer and the possums. So this is a real thing for those of us in this room. What helps me to slow? Because if you're living at a fast pace, you're never going to have time to look inside your purse or your sack. You'll just say, well, I'm just going to live with that. I don't have time to look at it. I don't have time to do this work. There has to be something in our lives that has the capacity to slow us so that we can do this work. The third thing, what helps you see yourself more honestly, particularly your shadow, and by that I mean whatever is in your sack. And the invitation here is not to judge what you find, but just to notice it. Just notice it. You're not judging, okay? You're not judging your shadow. You're not judging what's in your sack or your purse. You just notice it. What helps you to see yourself more honestly, to see whatever's in your sack? And then the fourth thing, what event or activity or time in which you regularly participate usually ends in anger or frustration for you? Is there something that you're regularly engaged in that you most always come away from that thing mad or frustrated or flustered? Okay? And again, no judging yourself for whatever it is, just notice it. Just notice it without judging yourself. That in itself is a helpful spiritual practice, just to notice it and not judge it. Okay? So resist the temptation to judge whatever comes up. Notice, don't judge. Noticing is a part of this bigger picture of awareness that we've talked about. Okay? All right. Okay, the last thing I want to do with you is a prayer, and then Victor, you'll come up and do the close. Prayer on page 9. From Psalm 127. It's about one page long, page 9 and 10, so let's offer this together from Psalm 127. Unless you, O God, give us firm footing on which to stand, we sink into sand and stubble. Without you, we build short-sighted lives with no regard for the largeness of our soul's desire. If the searchlight of your love does not illumine even the darkest, most secret corners of our lives, we live in deceit, dishonest to you, others, and even to ourselves. We frantically seek purpose, some elusive meaning in life, preoccupied by busyness, a distracting inner clatter that never ceases. We run to our work early and stay at it late, desperately searching for something or someone large enough to give meaning to our lives. Busy lives become our food, the bread we eat, sorry sustenance for people whose hearts are hungry. Then, wired for productivity, we live in such anxiety that we can't sleep when it's time to rest. We have forgotten, God, that your restorative rhythm includes work and rest. Draw us into simplicity, you who are the center of life, away from worry and distraction toward the one thing necessary, the one thing which makes us whole and lives at the core of us. Then, fully alive, our living will bring you glory. Amen. Thank you.